Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Middle East Forums podcast series featuring talks from Middle East Forums projects. I am Cliff Smith of the Middle East Forums Washington project, and I'll be moderating this discussion today. The format of this webinar and podcast will be a 15-minute interview followed by 15 minutes of question and answer from the audience. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type a question. And now I am pleased to introduce our guest, Seth Oldmixon. Seth is a former Peace Corps volunteer in Bangladesh and the founder of Liberty South Asia. He is an expert on the region, and he is here to discuss the Middle East and South Asia come together. As the name suggests, the Middle East Forum, we at the Middle East Forum are predominantly concerned with the Middle East. However, the world is increasingly interconnected, and in a world where relationships between countries far outside the Middle East have a large impact on what happens within the Middle East and with those that are interacting with the Middle East. This has always been the case, but it is increasingly so, and it is even more true today now than it was even very recently. And the connections and relationships with state actors, non-state actors, many others are growing daily, and the importance of them is growing daily. Moreover, the problems in the Middle East, such as the ideological contagion of radical Islam, knows no bounds. What is in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East, and what is in South Asia does not stay in South Asia, and vice versa. I'll get started by asking a few questions, just as I said, and then go to the audience questions, so you can start typing them whenever you'd like. In the meantime, Seth, let's start with the big issue here. The collaboration between India and Israel is increasingly public. For just a few examples, Prime Minister Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel. The Islamist foes of Israel and India are increasingly openly working together, and they are increasingly large trade partners as well. So basically, big picture question, how have we gotten here? What is the future of this relationship? What are potential pitfalls that we might want to look at?
Thanks, Cliff, and thanks for having me today. As you mentioned, things don't stay within borders or regions as we would like them to. And I think that the relationship between India and Israel is one that really demonstrates that. Look, Israel is a Middle Eastern democracy, and it has, been threatened by violent extremist groups in the region, Islamist groups in particular, for a long time. India is not only the largest democracy in South Asia, it is really the largest democracy in the world. And India too has also suffered from attacks by violent extremist Islamist groups in the region. And quite often these groups do collaborate. There have been instances of collaboration, information, personnel sharing between radical extremist groups like Jamaat al-Dawa, also known as Lashkar-e-Taiba, that has been responsible for some really horrible terrorist attacks in India, collaborating with radical Islamist groups in Palestine. So, we see these radical groups don't recognize borders, and India and Israel, both as democracies, have a shared interest in protecting themselves, but also in defeating this violent extremist ideology that sees no borders. You mentioned trade; they have been large trade partners. India has also been they have a major trade in security and in arms. Between, I believe, 2015 to 2019, India made up something like 45% of Israeli military hardware procurement. So, and that's the sort of the public side of things. There's also certainly intelligence sharing and intelligence cooperation working against these shared groups. Now, pitfalls, one of the, I think, real challenges here is that they feed, this cooperation, as important as it is, can feed the radical propaganda, the conspiracy theories. So one of the things we hear in South Asia among the extremist talking points is a reference to Hindu Zionists, and really trying to play up this India-Israeli nexus from the perspective of a radical, extremist ideological conspiracy. And in fact, this has impacts outside of India as well. We saw earlier this year where Bangladesh, another South Asian democracy, one that was founded as a secular state and has, since founding in 1971, really struggled against attempts to turn it into a theocratic state. We saw the current government earlier this year removed the reference in the Bangladeshi passport to not allowing travel to Israel. And there was quickly a large outcry, particularly among far right and radical Islamist groups, suggesting that this was some sort of conspiracy, that this was some sort of the government of Bangladesh being controlled by Western powers or something like that. It's all utterly ridiculous, but you see how this can feed into these extremist narratives that they use for recruitment.
Yeah, you make a good point. And beyond that, one thing that's interesting is I've noticed actually some of these same radical Islamist actors that you're talking about are actually also specifically in public going after both India and Israel for the arms trade that you mentioned and trying to make this into some grand conspiracy.
Of course.
Which is just interesting. I mean, there's been quite a few articles written in Qatari propaganda, Turkish propaganda, Pakistani propaganda. And that actually leads me to my next question, which is another big issue is the increasingly close relationship between Turkey and Pakistan. Of course, these countries have a historic relationship. It's not new. But Erdogan, I would say, has increasingly been looking to non-Muslim majority, non-Arab Muslim majority countries, that is, as the Arab world has drifted away from his direction and his way of looking at things, to sort of set him up as a world leader. And they are increasingly thus, Pakistan and Turkey are increasingly collaborating on economics and even in conflict areas with non-Arab Muslim majority countries, Pakistan chief among them. Just recently, Turkey and Pakistan signed a protocol to improve interparliamentary ties, and conflict areas such as Cyprus, Kashmir, and the Israel-Palestine dispute were specifically mentioned as areas where they may collaborate. Where do you think this is going? And what do you think each of these countries are trying to get out of their relationship with each other?
Sure. Well, so I think that Turkey and Pakistan are very interesting to talk about, especially together. Here you have two countries that sort of come from these sort of parallel traditions that were nominally secular. You have Ataturk's secular approach to society in Turkey, and the founding father of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, despite Pakistan being established as a Muslim country, it's sort of complicated with the two-nation theory, but Muhammad Ali Jinnah in his early speeches was explicitly secular in his thinking. And what you've seen in both countries, especially recently, but certainly in Pakistan quite quickly, was a reversion to this idea of a society and a state that is based in a religious identity, and one that tends to become more extreme. So where you have these two leaders in both countries, Imran Khan in Pakistan and Erdogan in Turkey, they both have a vision of their societies and of the future that is largely defined by a very theocratic, a very religiously defined, radically religiously defined social and political identity. And there's something that, there are, in Pakistan, especially among radical Islamist extremist groups, violent extremist groups, there is something that folks may have heard some talk about, but this prophecy known as Ghazwa-e-Hind. And it's the idea that the Islamist groups are going to rise up and conquer all of India, really all of South Asia. And there's behind this idea is this, again, transnational, transregional idea of the rise of an Islamic caliphate, an Islamic theocracy that is transnational. And I think that, in Turkey, especially, you can see there's a book that I want to recommend if you haven't read it. It's by Tamim Ansari. And the title of the book is Destiny Disrupted. And what it looks at is the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the last caliphate, and this idea that is prevalent among some that that was an anomaly in history and that the caliphate is going to rise again. And I think that there are parallels in that sort of prophetic future of an Islamic global caliphate that can be found in the political thinking between Pakistan and Turkey, and so they have that in common.
Yeah. On the topic of that, we are witnessing before our eyes the complete withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Afghanistan, and there's a lot of people wondering what's going to come next. This is true both for Afghanistan, but also what the U.S. retreat will mean for the wider region. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that what happens in Afghanistan matters to the Middle East. One only needs to think about Osama bin Laden and 9/11 to make that painfully obvious. So how do you think that'll affect both South Asia and the Middle East? And how do you think that will affect those who subscribe to sort of a radical ideology, be that political Islamists, jihadist groups, some combination of the two, so on and so forth?
Well, I think that we're already seeing some of that. We're already seeing a lot of these radical Islamist groups pointing to this, as they have been for years, as a proof of this prophetic vision of the return of this sort of global Islamic caliphate. It's been very encouraging to, let's just be honest, it's been very encouraging to violent extremist groups because they see this as, a demonstration of this sort of ragtag band of Islamic jihadi fighters being able to defeat, not just the world's, but, arguably, history's most powerful force. And they see that as proof of their mission and proof that they will succeed. So I think it's going to continue to be encouraging. I'll recommend a recent article in Foreign Affairs by Pakistan's former ambassador Hussein Haqqani, who is now at the Hudson Institute, where he talks about with Pakistan in particular, but I think the lessons can be extrapolated far beyond of the consequences, the blowback for the region that is very likely to come from this rapid withdrawal. I'm one who, I'll tell you, Cliff, I think that there may be a slight overstatement of the U.S. withdrawal from the region. Certainly, ground forces are being withdrawn. I would certainly hope that the United States is not completely, just walking away from the area.
Sure.
I think that would.
Yeah,
be
no, I intended to say withdrawal from Afghanistan, the troops. I should have said Afghanistan, not the region. That was.
Well, sure, no, but to that point, I think that Pakistan certainly has facilitated the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's demonstrated by the leadership living there. Sort of passing rather freely over the border. once the Taliban, if they are successful in taking power again, you're already seeing groups in Pakistan, violent extremist groups like Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban that has been violently against the Pakistani state and the Pakistani military, looking at this as a victory for them as well. So I think we're going to see this this lesson taken throughout the region.
We've already kind of covered this, but another thing I wanted to ask about was sort of a little bit more specific of the same basic topic. I mean, last year I wrote an article called "We Are All Hamas," which talked about the very open and somewhat direct collaboration between groups like Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan and the wider South Asian region and Hamas. They were openly touting each other's causes, sending each other money, things like that. There's a lot more of this kind of common cause between radical groups, terrorist groups in both the Middle East and South Asia, particularly as the winds have shifted in South Asia. How do you think this will matter in terms of what they, in other words, what I'm trying to say, Saudi Arabia, for example, is cracking down on the Brotherhood. So is Egypt. They are not nearly as, some of these Islamist groups not really well accepted. In South Asia, particularly like Pakistan, it's much different. How do you think that will affect things going forward?
Absolutely. So, in Pakistan, there is this idea of Afghanistan, the need to have a Pakistani puppet or a very friendly Pakistani regime in Afghanistan in order to provide what is known as strategic depth in their sort of this ongoing forever war against India that they feel that they're fighting. And the strategic depth comes from the fact that Pakistan is not very large geographically, and so it gives Afghanistan having at least a proxy control over Afghanistan gives Pakistan the ability to strategically retreat, regroup. It gives them access to logistics and hardware and things through other channels that they can then use, should they need to, in their forever war against India. Similarly, we've seen in the past where you mentioned Osama bin Laden earlier. Osama bin Laden's not South Asian. He was not Afghan, but he had set up his camp, Al-Qaeda, the base in Afghanistan. And the reason why is that it provided a friendly environment where they could carry out their training and logistics activities, their planning, if not with explicit support, certainly without any hindrance. And as we see, countries in the Middle East cracking down on violent extremist groups, and Afghanistan under Taliban control is very likely to revert to that. It's very likely to revert to a place where radical, violent extremist Islamist groups throughout the Middle East are able to regroup and come together, to prepare for the next phase. We have to, always remember these groups are not fighting a war that's been going on for 20 years. They're fighting a war that, to them has been going on for over 1,000.
We're running a little bit behind here, but let me ask one last question before we get to the audience questions. But audience, you can please start typing in questions. Another thing the Middle East Forum pays attention to is Islamist groups in the West. They're unquestionably quite open proxies of South Asian radicals. The Islamic Circle of North America is an open, obvious, and admitted proxy for Jamaat-e-Islami. They are also increasingly making common cause with Muslim Brotherhood organizations that have the roots in the Middle East, in the West. I wonder if you want to comment the nature of some of these groups and if there are any such groups that are being overlooked in terms of how they are affecting America's politics and the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The two that, as we've been saying this whole time, you see these ideologies and these groups are able to easily, traverse state boundaries, regional boundaries, the West, the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU. None of us have impenetrable barriers to this. And in fact, in recent years, certainly we've seen this come to fruition, both in terms of radical Islamist attacks in Western countries carried out by people who have had relationships, sometimes traveled to the Middle East or South Asia for training and indoctrination, and then coming back and carrying out attacks. And some of these are very well known. We all know about, we've heard about individuals having ties with Al-Qaeda and individuals having ties with ISIS. But there are, like, as you mentioned, other organizations. Jamaat-e-Islami is often talked about as an on-ramp for these organizations. There are two in particular that are often overlooked that I want to point out, one being the Khatmi Nubuwat, which is a very violent, radical Islamist movement, largely in South Asia, largely out of Pakistan, that targets Ahmadi Muslims and murders them. And then there's another one known as Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir operates, kind of ironically, Hizb ut-Tahrir has actually been banned in a lot of Middle Eastern and South Asian countries as a violent extremist terrorist organization, but they still continue to operate rather freely in the United States and the United Kingdom. And so you will see them carrying out, demonstrations with, big black flags and, demands to, behead people and establish a global caliphate. Again, this is all part of this shared prophetic vision of a global caliphate. But Khatmi Nubuwat they import people, evangelizers for these ideologies. Khatmi Nubuwat brings them in from Pakistan and holds meetings and conventions here in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and those have resulted in violence.
Scary thing to think about. To the audience questions. Dennis was wondering how Pakistan and Turkey's alliance, perhaps alliance is the right word, but relationship with Iran, what that is, and then how will China, who is increasingly close to Pakistan, sort of navigate those relationships they have with each other?
Those are two great questions. So Iran is an interesting one because Iran is kind of the odd man out in the region because Iran is Shia. And while there are certainly overlaps between a shared vision of spreading theocracy, there are some disagreements in the details and some pretty big ones about what that theocracy is going to look like. And I think that with Pakistan and Iran, there are particularly interesting things to watch where they have a hot and cold relationship. In fact, while they have some very important shared goals and aims, there has been an ongoing series of skirmishes, especially along the border between radical groups out of Pakistan that go into Iran to carry out attacks, and then border guard retaliation inside Pakistan. And it's important to remember Pakistan in particular has really been rocked in recent decades by sectarian violence. So, there is not a sort of uniformity of, when we talk about, radical Islam, there are many different forms of radical Islam. And one of these in Pakistan in particular, though certainly not unique to that, is an anti-Shia strain. And then China. China again is another sort of wild card. And I say that because China tends to operate behind the scenes a lot more, which Pakistan and other countries like Pakistan because they don't get embarrassed on the world stage. But and China is also uninterested in human rights in the way that the United States and the United Kingdom, the EU are. So China will overlook a lot of things as long as they're getting their economic development programs in. They're willing to really kind of look the other way about a lot of human rights stuff. Now, where the wild card bit comes in is that China does not have a lot of patience with radical violent extremism when it comes to China. And we have seen a few times recently, in fact, within the past couple of weeks, there was a rare occurrence of Chinese state-backed voices threatening Pakistan and saying, look, if you can't clean up the violent extremist situation on our border, we're going to come in there and do it ourselves. So I think that those conversations are being had. Again, they're being had behind the scenes. China is not interested in a global caliphate. So I think that is something to pay attention to.
This kind of feeds into another question that David in the audience was asking. He was saying that the ethnic differences between Sunni and Shia and other sort of ethnic and national differences make pan-Islamic thinking difficult, obviously, when the rubber meets the road. How do you see that playing out in South Asia and in the Middle East in general? I mean, you sort of touched on that when you talked about Iran and Pakistan, but is there a sort of a wider issue of how this breaks down in the world and in South Asia?
I think in the wider world, we tend to see what are high-level cooperations, and that's because there are, basically you have the enemy of my enemy is my friend type thinking, and so it's, look, we're all together against the West, right? But once that sort of breaks away, then you see where things start to break down and become more schismatic. In the Islamic extremist narrative, there's a lot of talk. They reference the Ummah, which is the global community of Muslims, and it's an interesting idea. It's rather like talking about Christendom, right? And we can talk about Christendom as like this sort of global community of Christians, but we also recognize that there's certainly unlikely to be anytime in the future a workable sort of global Christian theocracy. It hasn't worked in the past. In the 14th century, there were 2 popes for a period. And as things break into sects, we see that more. So, and Pakistan is I think a particularly good opportunity to look at what that looks like. You mentioned Jamaat-e-Islami earlier. Jamaat-e-Islami is a transnational, it's a global radical Islamist organization whose goal is to establish an Islamic theocracy of their imagining, right? But the way that they operate in different countries tells you a little bit about what the political situations in those countries are. Because in India, they're much more moderate in their actions, but they don't have a lot of room to move. So they operate with as much space as they're given. In Bangladesh, they have a little bit more space, although the Awami League government that's currently in power has really made a priority of breaking up their power, Jamaat-e-Islami's power and influence in that country. In Pakistan, they really have free reign. There are really no restraints on their ability to evangelize, to organize, and as I mentioned before, to operate as an on-ramp, to bring people in, to identify where they could be useful in this sort of broader radical movement, and then shift them over into these organizations. The idea of a single, Islamic global caliphate is, theoretically unworkable. There's just not enough, coherence in ideology. But as long as there is a sort of enemy of my enemy is my friend, we can set aside our differences as long as we're, operating against the United States or Europe. we're going to see those cooperations. And then as they gain power in these regions, or in these, more localized areas, you're going to see more of these violent skirmishes break out that are interscene warfare.
We're running out of time, but just what you can answer in 1 minute. You mentioned that HinduZionism, or at least the word used, was being demonized by Islamists, and I think you're talking about sort of the Hindus and the Zionists working together is sort of this bigger ideology. But can you expound a little bit on what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, so this is a phrase that's sort of bandied about usually by radical conspiracy theorists. And it's this idea that, first of all, there is a broad sort of belief in a global Jewish conspiracy, right? In the effort to demonize India in particular, and to spread that demonization beyond the kind of localized Pakistan-India fight. They really latch on to any way to sort of tie India, make a connection between India and Israel, to sort of loop India into this supposed, global Jewish conspiracy, in order to make their fight against India relevant to, radical Islamists outside of South Asia, in the Middle East in particular.
Yeah, I'll just add to that you can certainly see that in the United States with the various Islamist franchises from both the Middle East and South Asia. They're increasingly not only working together, but they're demonizing both Israel and India in the same language. Anyhow, wish we had more time. This has been great. I appreciate you coming on to talk to us, and I think we're going to see a lot more interesting things happening in the region, and maybe sometime we'll talk about them again. But thank you again very much for coming on. Thank you, audience, for joining us here, and have a good day. Have a good weekend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cliff.